I thought using the divorce word would finally make him listen and stop questioning every decision I made. How did one night of needing space turn into losing access to our accounts, our home routine, and the respect of people who used to take my side? I never imagined that threatening to leave would mean he'd be the one who actually closed the door first. My name is Cressida, and I am 32 years old, working as a digital marketing manager for a mid-sized agency that handles lifestyle brands and wellness influencers, which means I spend most of my day crafting campaigns about authenticity and living your truth without apology. I have always believed in radical honesty and personal freedom, and I refuse to be the kind of person who shrinks herself to fit someone else's expectations or asks permission for basic decisions about my own life. I have been with Julian for 4 years, married for 2, and while I love him in the way you love someone who is stable and dependable, I have started to feel like he questions too much and trusts too little, and I have begun to think that maybe his need for constant reassurance and explanation is less about care and more about control. After returning from a friend's party on a Friday night in late October, I stood in our shared apartment bedroom and told Julian that I was going to stay at a hotel for the night to decompress alone, because the party had been loud and crowded and I needed physical space to process the evening without anyone asking me questions or needing anything from me. Julian was sitting on the edge of the bed taking off his shoes, and he looked up at me with that patient expression he always has when I announce something sudden, and he asked why home was not an option for decompressing when we had a comfortable apartment and a quiet bedroom where I could have all the space I needed. I explained that I needed to be physically away from the apartment, not just in another room, because sometimes you need a change of environment to really clear your head. And he asked if something had happened at the party or if there was something specific bothering me that we should talk about before I left. His questions felt like an interrogation rather than concern, and I told him that his need to control where I slept was exactly the kind of behavior that made me feel suffocated. And I said that if he kept this up, maybe we should just get a divorce because I was not going to live my life asking permission for every decision I made. The word hung in the air between us, sharper than I had intended, and Julian went quiet for a long moment before saying that he was not trying to control me, but that leaving for a hotel without any prior conversation felt sudden and confusing, and he just wanted to understand what had changed in the last hour that made staying home feel impossible. I told him he was making it bigger than it was, and that if he trusted me, he would not need an explanation for everything. And I picked up my phone and booked a rideshare to a hotel near the downtown area. The rideshare receipt showed a timestamp of 11:47 at night, and by the time I checked into the hotel lobby, it was past midnight, and I texted Julian that I would be back in the morning and that we could talk then if he still felt the need to make this into a big issue. The next morning when I returned to the apartment, Julian was sitting in the living room with his laptop open, and he tried to revisit the conversation by saying that he had thought about it overnight and wanted to understand the pattern, because this was the 3rd time in 2 months that I had left for the night after some kind of disagreement or social event, and he wanted to know if there was something deeper going on that we needed to address together. I told him that there was no pattern, just occasional moments when I needed space, and that his obsession with tracking and analysing my movements was exactly the kind of behaviour that made me want to leave in the first place. Julian asked why leaving for a hotel felt necessary after a normal party night when we had a comfortable home, and he pointed to the rideshare receipt in our shared email account, showing I had left at 11:47 without any prior indication of needing space, and he wanted to know what specific event or conversation at the party had made staying home feel impossible in that moment. I said I did not need to provide a timeline or justification for needing personal space, and that his demand for explanations proved exactly why I needed distance, because he could not accept that sometimes I just needed to be alone without it being a crisis or a mystery he had to solve. Julian said he was not demanding anything, just asking for basic communication about decisions that affected both of us, and he suggested that maybe we could agree to discuss the need for space before acting on it, so that neither of us was left confused or worried in the middle of the night. I told him I would not ask permission to take space when I needed it, and that if he could not handle my independence, maybe we were not compatible. And maybe the divorce threat I had made last night was not as dramatic as he seemed to think it was. Julian listened without interrupting, which is something he has started doing more often lately. And when I finished speaking, he said he needed to understand the pattern because this was not just about one night, but about a repeated behavior that left him feeling uncertain about our stability and unable to plan or feel secure in the relationship. I told him he was being overdramatic and that real relationships do not require constant reassurance and updates about every decision. And I posted a vague status on social media about partners who make you justify basic freedom and how exhausting it is to be with someone who cannot trust you to make your own choices. Later that afternoon, Julian mentioned that he had a calendar entry at 3:40 in the afternoon at a place called Harbour District, and he said he would be out for a few hours running errands and meeting someone about a work-related project. I did not ask for details because I was still annoyed about the morning conversation, and I spent the rest of the day working on client campaigns and scrolling through social media. And when Julian came back around 6 in the evening, he seemed quieter than usual, and there was a new distance in the way he moved through the apartment, as if he was observing rather than engaging. That evening, I walked past the dining table and saw his laptop open with several browser tabs visible. And I noticed one labelled storage options and another labelled notary near me. And when I moved closer to get a better look, Julian closed the laptop quickly and said he was just organising old files and handling some routine paperwork that had been piling up. The browser tabs felt significant but vague, and I told myself he was probably just cleaning up digital clutter or dealing with administrative tasks related to his job. But a small part of me wondered why he had minimised the screen so quickly when I approached, and why he had not mentioned anything about storage or notary services during our earlier conversation about his afternoon plans. The following week, I met my longtime friend Simone Kerr at a coffee shop with outdoor patio seating, and I vented to her about how Julian had freaked out over one hotel stay and was now acting cold and distant, as if I had committed some terrible betrayal by needing a night to myself. Simone listened while sipping her latte, and she asked a few gentle questions about whether Julian had a history of being controlling, or if this was a new behaviour, and I explained that he had always been a little too focused on routines and explanations, but lately it had gotten worse, and he seemed to be tracking my movements and questioning my decisions more than ever before. While we were talking, I recorded a voice note on my phone describing Julian's dramatic reaction to the hotel stay, and I plan to send it to Simone later as a follow-up to our conversation, because sometimes it is easier to articulate your frustrations out loud than in a text message. That Friday evening, Julian and I attended a group dinner at a friend's restaurant in a private dining room, and the atmosphere was relaxed and social, with about 6 of our mutual friends gathered around a long table sharing appetizers and wine. At some point during the meal, the conversation turned to relationships and compromises, and I made a joke that Julian needed permission slips signed in triplicate before I could go anywhere. And I said it loud enough that the whole table heard, and a few people laughed uncomfortably while others exchanged glances. Julian stayed quiet and did not respond to the joke, but I could see the tension in his shoulders and the way he focused on his plate instead of looking at me or anyone else. And Dev Malhotra, one of our mutual friends, watched the exchange with a neutral expression that gave nothing away. After dinner, we drove home in silence, and once we were back in the apartment living room, Julian asked why I had chosen to joke about our private disagreement at the group dinner in front of 6 people, and he referenced the moment when I made the permission slips comment right after the waiter refilled my wine glass, and he wanted to know what I hoped to accomplish by turning our conflict into public entertainment. I told him I was just being honest with friends and that his inability to laugh at himself showed how uptight he had become, and I said that everyone at the table agreed that he was being too sensitive about a harmless comment, even if they were too polite to say it out loud. Julian said he was not upset about the joke itself, but about the pattern of discussing our private issues in public settings in ways that framed him negatively, and he asked if I could agree to handle our disagreements privately instead of using our friends as an audience or a jury. I accused him of trying to control how I spoke to my friends, and I said that if he was so worried about his reputation, maybe he should stop giving me things to talk about, and I suggested that his constant questioning and boundary setting were the real problem, not my honesty. Later that evening, I was texting with Simone and decided to send her the voice note I had recorded earlier at the coffee shop, but in my distraction, I accidentally included it in a group message thread with several mutual friends before realizing my mistake and deleting it within seconds. The voice note had described Julian's meltdown over the hotel stay in detail, including my frustration with his need to track and analyze everything I did, and the tone of my voice had been dismissive and mocking in a way that felt private and justified when I recorded it, but probably sounded harsh to anyone listening without context. Dev saved the voice note file before I deleted it from the group thread, and he did not mention it to me or to anyone else at the time, but he filed it away mentally as part of a pattern he had been noticing for months. The next day, Julian mentioned that he heard I had sent and then deleted a message in the group thread at 10:34 the previous night, and he said he needed me to stop discussing our private issues with friends in ways that framed him negatively, because it made it harder to resolve things when outside opinions were already formed and people had taken sides before hearing both perspectives. I asked how he even knew about the deleted message, and I accused him of monitoring my texts and tracking my digital activity, and I said that his obsession with timestamps and message logs was creepy and invasive and proved exactly why I needed space from him in the first place. Julian explained that he was not monitoring anything, but that someone in the group had mentioned seeing a notification before the message disappeared, and he was just asking me to be mindful of how public discussions affected our ability to work through things privately. I told him that if he was so worried about what people thought, maybe he should stop acting in ways that gave me reasons to vent to my friends, and I said that his fixation on controlling the narrative was more concerning than anything I had said in a private voice note that no one was supposed to hear anyway. Over the next few days, Julian started changing small routines around the apartment, and I noticed that he was opening mail alone at the kitchen counter instead of leaving it in the shared space, and he had moved his wallet and personal documents from the dresser we shared to a drawer in the home office. And when I asked why he was reorganizing things, he said he was just trying to keep his paperwork more organized and make it easier to find things when he needed them. A few days later, I received a text from my younger sister Lena asking if we could talk because she had heard something concerning from a mutual friend and wanted to hear my side before forming an opinion. The neutrality of Lena's tone felt wrong because she usually supported me automatically without needing to hear both sides, and the fact that she was asking for my perspective instead of just believing me made me wonder what version of events had reached her and who had been talking to her about my marriage. I drove to Lena's townhouse the next afternoon, and as soon as she opened the door, I launched into an explanation of how Julian was spiraling over nothing and punishing me with silence and cold behavior because I had taken one night to myself at a hotel. Lena invited me inside and we stood in the entryway near the coat closet, and she asked what specifically had happened and why mutual friends seemed concerned. And I told her that Julian was obsessing over one hotel stay and acting like I had committed some unforgivable act by needing space, and that he was now documenting everything I did and organizing his life as if he was planning to leave or punish me in some calculated way. Lena listened carefully, and then she gently suggested that threatening divorce during an argument might be escalating things unnecessarily, and she asked if I had considered how Julian might interpret those words coming from me repeatedly over the course of several months. I accused Lena of siding with Julian before even hearing the full story, and I said that her willingness to question my version of events instead of supporting me unconditionally showed that he had already gotten to her and poisoned her perspective. And I told her that if she could not be on my side, then I did not need her advice or her judgment. Lena said she was not taking sides, just trying to understand what was happening so she could help, and she asked if Julian had done anything specific to hurt me or control me, or if the conflict was more about communication styles and different expectations, and her calm questions made me feel defensive rather than supported. And I left her townhouse feeling angry and betrayed. Back at the apartment kitchen later that evening, Julian calmly stated that he was opening a separate checking account for clarity on shared expenses, and he said he had already initiated the process and would keep me updated on how we would handle bills and payments moving forward. I demanded to know why he was making unilateral financial decisions without consulting me first, and I accused him of hiding money and trying to control me through financial separation. And he explained that the repeated threats of divorce made shared finances feel unstable, and that having separate accounts would protect both of us if the relationship ended and would make it easier to track individual contributions if we decided to separate our lives more formally. I told him that his decision to open a separate account proved he did not trust me and that he was using money as a weapon to punish me for speaking my mind, and I threatened divorce again, saying that if he did not trust me with shared finances, then maybe we should not be married at all. Julian asked why I felt the need to tell Lena that he was spiraling when he had been consistently calm and had only asked me to stop threatening divorce during arguments, and he mentioned that I had made this framing at Lena's front hallway at 2:15 in the afternoon before Lena had even asked for details, and he wanted to know what outcome I was hoping for by shaping the narrative before anyone else could speak. I said I was just venting to my sister, and that his obsession with tracking times and locations proved my point about him being controlling. And I told him that normal people do not document every conversation and movement as if they are building a case in court. Julian said he needed me to stop threatening divorce unless I genuinely meant it, because the uncertainty made it impossible to plan or feel secure. And he pointed to the separate mail stack he had started keeping on the kitchen counter as an example of practical steps he was taking to protect both of us if the threats were real. I told him he was being dramatic and manipulative, and that real marriages do not require walking on eggshells about language, and I accused him of using financial control to punish me for speaking my truth. Over the following days, Julian stopped engaging in circular arguments, and he started declining invitations to social events where I would be present, saying he was busy or tired, and he spent more time with his older brother Nathan, and less time trying to convince me that we needed to change how we communicated. His phone was always charged and always near him, face down on whatever surface he set it on, and he seemed to be waiting for something rather than fighting for something. And the shift in his energy made me more uncomfortable than his earlier questions and concerns had. One evening, while Julian was in the home office, I walked past and saw his laptop screen displaying a notification that read, "Document upload successful, cloud backup complete," and when I asked what he was backing up, he said, "Just work files and household records," and he did not elaborate further or show me what he had been organizing. The vague answer and the deliberate cloud backup felt more significant than his neutral tone suggested, and I had the sense that he was preparing for something I had not fully considered yet, but I told myself he was just being paranoid and overdramatic as usual, and that his need to document and organize everything was just another example of his controlling personality, rather than a reasonable response to anything I had actually done. A week later, Dev invited Julian to his apartment to talk privately, and in Dev's living room, Dev showed Julian the saved voice note file that I had accidentally sent to the group thread weeks earlier, along with a simple timeline he had been keeping of public mockery incidents with dates and locations, including the permission slips joke at the restaurant dinner and several other comments I had made in group settings over the past few months. Julian listened calmly and thanked Dev for sharing the information, and he asked if Dev would be willing to provide the file and timeline if it became necessary later, and Dev agreed without hesitation, saying that he cared about both of us, but that the pattern had become uncomfortable to witness, and he thought Julian deserved to know what people were seeing and hearing. I found out about the conversation through a mutual friend who mentioned that Dev had met with Julian privately, and I immediately texted Dev accusing him of picking sides and betraying my trust, and I told him that if he had concerns about my behavior, he should have come to me directly instead of going behind my back to share private information with Julian. Dev did not respond to my text, and the silence felt like a judgment and a rejection. And I posted online about partners who weaponize your words and turn your friends against you, hoping that people would see the post and understand that I was the one being isolated and punished, not Julian. That evening, during a light rain that made soft sounds against the apartment kitchen window, I approached Julian with an offer to put everything behind us if he would agree to stop making our relationship into a legal issue and stop involving friends in our private conflicts. I told him I was willing to work things out and move forward, and I framed it as a compromise and a peace offering. And I said that if he could just drop the separate account situation and stop tracking everything I said and did, we could get back to normal and rebuild the trust that had been damaged over the past few months. Julian asked what specific changes I was offering, and he wanted to know if I would stop threatening divorce, stop mocking him publicly, and agree to handle conflicts respectfully and privately. And his questions felt like traps designed to make me admit fault rather than genuine attempts to find common ground. I said I would try to be more mindful of my language, but that he also had to stop involving friends in our business and stop treating our finances like a courtroom exhibit. And I told him that if he gave me a reason to trust him again, I would have no reason to vent to friends or take space when I needed it. Julian asked how he could feel secure without clear boundaries around the threats and the public mockery. And I said that real trust does not require insurance policies or documented proof. And I demanded that he delete everything he had been saving and stop acting like he needed protection from me. When he asked if I could commit to specific behavior changes rather than vague promises to try, I retreated to anger and accused him of twisting my good faith effort into something sinister. And I told him that his paranoia was exhausting and that maybe the problem was not my communication style, but his inability to accept me as I was. Julian asked why I had offered to compromise only after learning that Dev had shared documentation with him, noting that I had texted him at 8:52 in the evening, right after hearing about the meeting. And he wanted to know if the offer was about actually resolving the pattern or about controlling the information other people had. I said he was twisting my intentions and making me out to be manipulative when I was just trying to save our marriage, and I accused him of being impossible to please and determined to find fault in everything I did. Julian said he needed concrete commitments, no more public mockery, no more divorce threats during arguments, and private conflict resolution. And he explained that without those changes, the separate documentation he had been keeping would have to stay in place for his own clarity and protection. I told him he was blackmailing me with evidence and that real trust does not require documentation and backup files. And I demanded that he delete everything and start fresh with me. And when he did not agree, I walked away furious and convinced that he was using the situation to control and punish me rather than to genuinely protect himself. Over the next few days, Julian became extremely organized and emotionally controlled, and he kept his side of the apartment tidy and gathered his documents into neat labeled stacks on the dresser. And he no longer argued when I tried to provoke him into defending himself or explaining his behavior. Instead, he observed quietly and responded to my accusations with neutral statements about logistics and practical realities. And he updated passwords on his personal accounts and asked me practical questions about the lease terms and renewal process, saying he was just making sure he understood our obligations in case anything changed. On the dresser corner, I noticed a small USB drive labeled Records in his handwriting, and when I asked what was on it, he said just copies of household documents and important files, and he did not offer to show me or explain further. A few days after that conversation, I checked our shared autopay setup for streaming services and discovered that Julian had cancelled his half of the subscriptions without any warning or explanation. The joint accounts for streaming platforms, cloud storage, and music services now showed payment method removed and service ending dates in the near future, and the cancellations felt petty at first. But then I began to understand that they were part of a larger pattern of quiet detachment and logistical separation. And I wondered what other shared systems he had been quietly dismantling while I was not paying attention. Frustrated by the subscription cancellations and by the sense that I was losing control of the narrative, I posted in our mutual friend group chat that Julian had been financially isolating me and tracking my movements, and I said that I needed support during a difficult time and that I hoped people would understand what I was going through. Within an hour, Dev responded with a calm correction, and he shared a timeline of the divorce threats I had made over the past 3 months, along with context about the public mockery incidents. And he noted that Julian had opened the separate account only after the third threat, and that the financial separation was a protective response rather than an act of control or punishment. Simone quietly left the group chat without commenting, and Lena replied asking me to please handle this privately instead of continuing to post about it in public forums, and another friend reacted with only a concerned emoji and nothing else. The silence from most of the group felt louder than any words could have been, and I deleted my post within minutes, but I knew that screenshots had already been taken and that the correction Dev had posted would stay in people's minds longer than my original framing. That evening, Julian organised his final documents at the apartment dresser, and I saw him sorting through bank statements, the voice note file Dev had shared, rideshare receipts from the hotel night, confirmation emails from the hotel booking, screenshots of my social media posts, and a printed timeline with dates and brief descriptions of each divorce threat and public mockery incident. When I asked what the organised binder was for, he said he was just keeping household records clear and accessible, and he labelled the binder joint accounts in neat handwriting and placed it on the shelf above the dresser where it was visible but not intrusive. Late that night in the apartment living room, Julian sat down across from me and said he wanted to offer one final calm conversation about the pattern and what changes were needed for him to feel safe continuing the marriage. He explained that he was not trying to control me or punish me, but that the repeated threats and public mockery had created an environment where he could not plan for the future or feel secure in the relationship. And he said that if we were going to stay together, he needed 3 clear commitments from me. No more divorce threats unless I genuinely meant them. No more public mockery or negative framing of him in front of friends and family, and a willingness to discuss conflicts privately before taking unilateral actions like leaving for the night without any prior communication. I refused his offer and told him I would not be given ultimatums in my own marriage, and I said that his demands were controlling and unreasonable, and that if he could not handle my honesty and independence, then maybe divorce was exactly what we needed. For real this time. I told him that real partners accept each other as they are and do not require signed agreements and behaviour contracts. And I accused him of using the conversation as a way to force me into submission rather than as a genuine attempt to resolve our issues. Julian listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said he would handle things properly, and his tone was calm and final rather than angry or threatening, and he stood up and walked to the bedroom without saying anything else. The next morning, I saw Julian set a phone alarm labelled Forms, ready for 2 days later, and he placed the phone on the dresser corner near the USB drive without explaining what the alarm was for or what forms he was referencing. I asked what the reminder meant, and he said just routine paperwork he needed to take care of, and he dismissed my question in a way that felt deliberately vague, and I told myself he was just being dramatic and trying to make me worry. But the quiet action felt more significant than his neutral explanations suggested. 2 days later, I received a calendar invitation from Julian with the subject line Joint Account Review, and it listed a meeting time of 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon at a local bank branch, and the invitation noted that both parties were requested to attend. The formal phrasing and the bank setting felt ominous, but I assumed it was Julian's last attempt to work things out through some kind of mediated financial discussion, and I prepared talking points in my mind about why his behavior over the past few months had been unreasonable and controlling, confident that I could explain my side in a neutral setting and make him see that the real problem was his insecurity and need for constant reassurance, not my communication style or independence. I arrived at the bank office on Tuesday afternoon and was directed to a small meeting room with a glass partition separating it from the main lobby. And I sat down expecting to see a neutral mediator or financial advisor who would help us discuss shared expenses and budgeting. But instead, a bank representative introduced herself and explained that Julian had initiated formal account separation per legal advisory services, and that joint access to shared accounts was temporarily frozen pending written response from both parties. The representative presented a timeline that included the 3 documented divorce threats I had made, each marked with dates and brief context notes, and she explained that the repeated statements about ending the marriage had been flagged as relationship instability indicators, and that Julian's decision to open a separate account and formalize financial boundaries was a procedurally valid protective measure under the circumstances. I demanded to know why Julian had not just talked to me about this instead of ambushing me with legal procedures, and the representative clarified that the timeline showed multiple documented conversation attempts over the past 3 months with no resolution, and that the current action was a formalization of boundaries Julian had already communicated clearly and repeatedly. Julian presented organized evidence from the binder he had been keeping: the voice note files showing my mocking tone and dismissive language, the public mockery timeline with dates, locations, and witness names including Dev and others from the restaurant dinner, a log of the 3 divorce threats with full context for each incident, and the rideshare and hotel receipts showing the pattern of unilateral departure without prior communication. The bank representative confirmed that the separation procedure was neutral and designed to protect both parties, and she explained that Julian's individual account had been established and that I needed to respond in writing within 14 days regarding joint financial obligations and how we would handle shared expenses moving forward. I tried to claim that Julian was retaliating against me for speaking my mind, but the representative stated that the process followed standard protocol for documented relationship instability and that no judgment was being made about fault or cause, only about the practical need for financial clarity when one party had repeatedly indicated the marriage might end. Julian signed the final forms calmly and without making any dramatic statements, and he left the meeting room while I sat staring at the paperwork in front of me, and the representative asked if I had any questions about the 14-day response deadline or the procedure for establishing my own individual account if I chose to do so. The documented evidence and the procedural language made it impossible to reframe the situation as Julian being controlling or vindictive, because everything he had done was a direct response to words I had said and actions I had taken, and the timeline made it clear that he had tried to resolve things through conversation many times before taking any formal steps. Over the next 2 weeks, I moved to a temporary rental apartment because the lease renewal discussion had become too tense and complicated, and I had to establish a new address and figure out how to cover expenses on a single income without the shared cost-splitting Julian and I had relied on for years. My joint credit cards started showing payment method invalid errors, and I had to open new accounts and update all my automatic bill payments, and the budget shock of losing the shared expense structure hit harder than I had expected. The friend group chat stayed quiet, and party invitations stopped coming, and when I texted Simone asking if we could talk, she did not respond for days, and when she finally did, she said she needed distance from the situation and could not be in the middle of it anymore. At work, I started getting careful questions from colleagues who had mutual connections to our social circle, and the professional network that had always felt supportive and friendly now felt awkward and judgmental. And I had the sense that the voice note and the timeline had spread further than I realized. 3 days after the bank meeting, I texted Julian asking if we could talk like adults without lawyers and paperwork between us. And he responded once with a message that said all communication regarding shared obligations needed to be in writing through the documented channels until separation terms were finalized, and that his boundaries were clear and final. He did not respond to any follow-up texts, and the silence felt like a door closing. And I understood that the divorce I had threatened so many times as a way to win arguments and prove I had power was now actually happening. Except it was his paperwork, his timeline, and his terms, and I was left with nothing but the consequences of my own words. What I had believed gave me power, the ability to threaten divorce and force him to accept my independence without question, had instead created a documented pattern that made his formal boundaries not only justified, but procedurally inevitable. The ultimatum I had used as a weapon became the door he closed, and I was left holding the handle on the wrong side, staring at a stack of paperwork and wondering when exactly the lock had turned and why I had not seen it coming until it was too late to take any of it back. 6 weeks later, I scroll through social media and see a photo from Dev's birthday gathering, and Julian is in the background, talking calmly with Nathan and a few mutual friends who used to be part of my group, and no one tagged me in the event. My text to Simone asking what happened to loyalty has been left unread for 11 days. The bank account separation finalized last Tuesday, and the shared lease will not renew in my name. My sister Lena sent one message saying she loves me but cannot support the way I handled this, and that when I am ready to listen, she will be here. I open a draft text to Julian and type, "Can we just talk?" Then delete it, knowing his answer will be the same. Written communication only, through documented channels, until the separation terms are complete. The divorce I threatened so many times is now real, except it is his paperwork, his timeline, and his calm exit. And I am left alone with the voice note I thought was private, the threats I thought were tools, and the freedom I demanded that now just feels like a long, quiet echo in an empty apartment.